Okay, well, I am here with my friend, author John Frame, and he just wrote this book, Seven Attitudes of the Helping Heart: How to Live Out Your Faith and Care for the Poor. Got one right here. My copy came in yesterday that you sent me, John.
Great.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Um, I just kind of want to begin this podcast, our time together, to just let you know why I'm doing this with John and featuring his book. Uh, First and foremost, it's a good book, and I really enjoyed reading it. And John asked me to help kind of edit it and speak into it. But that's not why it's good. I wouldn't trust my editing or even sometimes what I have to say, especially even about this subject. But John is a very good writer, and I encourage people to read his book. But maybe more than that, even John's my friend, and he's been a friend of mine for a long time. I met John in undergrad at Anderson University. I was a Bible and religion major, and John Frame, he was in seminary at the time, and so and also he and his family moved to the hometown where I was from, right at all at the same time, and so we had all these connections going on, and so I met John, began to talk to John, and I realized John was a lot smarter than I was and a much better writer than me. And I had not done a whole lot of writing before undergrad, and my major required me as a Bible and religion major to do a lot of writing. And so John became kind of my de facto editor, and he asked me questions and told me things that I hadn't thought of before.
It was good fun.
Yeah. So you can tell people how bad a writer I am, John, if you want.
Oh, not at all.
That's a kind of how I met John. He officiated my wife and I's wedding in Birmingham, Alabama. He came all the way down to do that. So I appreciate John having done that. And then for people in our church or who are familiar with our church, part of our one of our ministries from our church is actually featured in this book called JoAnn's Pantry, which is a ministry to those who are in need of food. And so just a really cool thing for our church to be featured in the book. And so John, you want to kind of say hello and tell us where you're at this morning and what time it is there, and I'll tell them what time it is here.
Yeah, well, great, Josh. I mean, we've had a very good friendship for a long time, and we've had a lot of good times and good years together. And thank you for your interest. Thank you for your support on this book. You know, you don't know it, but actually you are one of only two people that I talked to about this book when I was thinking about writing the book about a year and a half ago. I reached out to you and Jim Lyon, and we did chat about it. We emailed quite a lot about it first, and then we did chat about it a couple times. And of course, I was able to get in touch with Luana Partlow to learn more about JoAnn's Pantry at your church. But to answer your question, I am in Istanbul, Turkey. So it's right now, it's 2:15 p.m. And what time are you at, Josh?
It's 6:15 a.m. here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'm about 8 hours ahead of you, and I like living here. My wife and I have lived here twice, actually. I've lived in Turkey twice. I've lived in Cambodia once, and I've lived in England, probably at least 3 times. And of course, I was born in the U.S. And so, but living here in Turkey, it presents some interesting experiences. And I share a tad about that in the book. It's very light, actually. I rely on some of my other experiences. One of the things I do mention in the book is the folks who are from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Turkey who walk around these streets and pick up recyclables from the dumpsters. And that's one of the things I share about, and how should we feel about things like that? And so I live in Turkey. It's a great place to live. I live in a great neighborhood, live in a great building, and I'm happy to live here.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, your life is always very interesting. I always feel like you're moving around or kind of in a new cool place.
We have moved around quite a lot, yes.
Yeah. And so, yeah, you're married to Ayşegül, who is Turkish. And that's kind of a cool story. We won't get into all of that because we do want to talk about the book, but maybe at the end we'll talk about some of that. But yeah, you got a lovely wife. And
I was going to say, I actually mentioned that story a bit, I believe, in my first book, Homeless at Harvard.
Yes.
I touch on that story in that book. But yeah, she's a great wife.
Yeah, which is an awesome story. I love your story. I've actually told it like in sermons and stuff before, because it's a cool story. So I do want to talk about your book here, and I encourage people to buy it, read it, get the study guide that comes with it. But what is it about? What's your book about? Seven Attitudes of the Helping Heart.
Yeah, so 7 Attitudes of the Helping Heart. You'll see that the graphic here is a heart, and it's a map of the world, right? And I think that a lot of times in our lives, we're often focused, because we're humans, we're focused on the here and now, the things that are going on in my life, in my family's life. And we should be concerned about those things. But there's a whole world out there, isn't there, Josh, where, there's a lot of need, and most of these needs and problems, injustices, sad things going on, we will never know about, we'll never hear about. And so this book is primarily a book that helps Christians think about the attitudes and the things in their lives that they can explore and develop in order to become better people of God. Most Christians, I think, want to have a closer relationship with God. They want to live out their faith more. And ultimately, part of that, at some point in life, we're going to think about those that don't have all that we have, whether we see them on the streets, we hear about them in our schools, we hear about them on the news, and these things oftentimes bother us. And we wonder, as I have wondered, where do we start? How do we begin? And this book is a beginner's journey of how to begin living out your faith and helping the poor. And that's what it's about. It's about these 7 attitudes of the helping heart that, when flourished, or when you encourage them to flourish in your life, will help you be the person that you really want to be.
Yeah. So, obviously you read through the Gospels and you read about Jesus' ministry, and you even read about the ministry of the early church. And Jesus was very interested in helping the poor, and getting even the Pharisees and Sadducees, scribes, to think about the poor, consider the poor. He also, said things like, "Hey, the poor will always be with you," while at the same time he didn't remove the responsibility of God's people, or his followers, to help. Um, I do think it's really easy, especially the way our culture is set up, and is to forget about the poor, or not think about the poor, or isolate ourselves, or kind of not know anybody who is in a different economic status than we are. Um, so sometimes it can be, actually, it's not that I think Christians are uncaring, or they don't care, because you read through the Gospels, you see what Jesus is doing, but it is hard to become sometimes really actually interested, like in other people's lives, if you are not poor, beyond maybe every once in a while watching a video and giving a check to a certain organization, or whatever. So how did you become interested in the poor? Like, why or when? Like, how did that happen? Because you've written a book, Homeless at Harvard, And for most people, I assume, watching this or listening to this have probably never heard of that book. When you were at Harvard, you lived as a homeless person for how long?
10 weeks.
10 weeks. So you were homeless for 10 weeks yourself, and you did everything a person without a home, a homeless person would do in that time, except you attended Harvard, you attended your classes at Harvard. But other than that,
Yeah.
you behaved as a homeless person. You got your food the way a homeless person would get their food, use the restroom the way a homeless person would use, like all of those sorts of things. Bathed the way a homeless person would bathe, from what you understood. But that wasn't even the beginning. So why or when did you become interested in the poor?
Yeah. Well, good question. Yeah, my book, Homeless at Harvard, is my story of my journey, 10 weeks on the streets. You know, because I was a Harvard student, and I had access to all of Harvard's books and buildings and bathrooms, I can't say, plus I had loving parents back in Ohio. I had money in the bank, probably, I had privileges and opportunities and a status that my homeless friends didn't have. And so I can't say that I was truly homeless for those 10 weeks, but I got, a small taste, right, of what the homeless community life was like outside of the gates of Harvard University. And that was, I would say that to answer your question, Josh, my first interests or concerns, I guess, about the people who are poor would be related to my time at Anderson. So you may remember when we were there together, there would be authors who would come in and speak. People who were working with the poor would come in and speak, and also we had students and friends who were interested in these things. And so I was deeply influenced by conversations about life as they knew it, as maybe I hadn't heard of, as they all of these things kind of converged, and I began to feel a bit unsettled about the kind of the normal Christian way of life and thinking, where we're often church focused or me focused because that's what the world is like. But there's a whole world out there that is in need. And so my first interest in being concerned about the poor was related to homelessness. And at that same time, I took a trip to London with my sister and to some other cities in the UK. And when I was walking in London one evening, I met a homeless man sitting on the street, and his name was John, like my name. And that was the first homeless person that I ever met. And we had a chat, and that was a pretty big influence on my life. When I left John that night, I never saw him again. But his story remained with me, and I've shared that encounter before or after that. And yeah, I think these small things, these conversations with friends, these encounters that we have. I also went on some spring break trips at Anderson to Atlanta, to connect with the homeless. So all these things, I think, together converged to kind of put in my mind a realization that there's a lot of poverty, a lot of things out there that aren't quite right or aren't right at all. And what can or should we do to help change that?
Yeah.
Or at least help bring awareness of it.
Yeah. And you, in your book, The 7 Attitudes of a Helping Heart, that kind of what you seem to be trying to do is cultivate a heart that cares for the poor and gives people maybe some ideas or motivation to show care. So tell us, what are the 7 attitudes of the helping heart?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the first two, and I put them together intentionally. The first two are gratitude and humility. And that chapter I have titled Living in the In-Between. Living in the in-between of gratitude and humility. The third attitude of the helping heart is empathy. And I think that empathy is something that we can develop and be intentional about, because I'm not sure that empathy is a natural human thing to have. It's something that I have struggled with quite a lot in my life. But I think that there are ways that we can help grow it in ourselves, so that way we're more empathetic. The fourth one is compassion. And compassion, in my book, I talk about how compassion is taking empathy one step further. It's putting a bit of action or a lot of action to our concern. So we've got gratitude and humility, empathy and compassion. And then the next two are generosity and holiness. And I put those together in the same chapter as well, because I believe that generosity is related to obedience. And when we're obedient to God, we feel more holy, and we are more holy. And I feel that when we're holy and we're all God wants us to be, then we have a heart that is probably more generous. And so I connect those in the chapter. So 5 and 6 is generosity and holiness. And then the 7th is hope. And that was one that you really helped me with. Hope, I talk about big hope in this book. Hope that some people have, that they can really make a difference. That's wonderful. That's big hope. Hope that we can make a difference on earth. And then, of course, we have this eschatological hope, hope for heaven someday. And there's all kinds of things in between. Hope that can help others have hope. So these are the 7. We've got gratitude and humility and empathy and compassion and generosity and holiness and hope.
Yeah. I know when we were talking about it, right, I was pushing strong for hope to make it in the book.
Thank you.
I wouldn't let you off. Part of it is because you only had 6 and you needed 7 attitudes to make it complete.
Exactly.
I was really worried that you weren't going to get to 7. And so
it really helped by having that one and by your encouragement of it. Thank you.
I'm just messing with you, but yeah, I found reading through all of them. It's like I said, it's really well written, and you make us think about all of those attitudes and whether or not we are cultivating them, having them, and even the struggle that you share about some of your struggles, and sometimes it's even funny. I laughed in your chapter about generosity when you're talking about generosity, and Icicle encourages you to give more than what you really had planned. And I laugh at that because, I could see Emily doing that, being like, well, wait a second, like, that's not what I had in mind. And so it's a very, it's not just like, hey, this is what you should do, this is what you should think, and you shouldn't struggle internally with different ways to help. And so I think it's very relatable for people. And you in the book too, you don't just talk about these attitudes, but you weave stories of people that you personally know. There's 3 different people that you weave stories in and out of these chapters that you write. You want to talk about them?
Yeah. So, I mentioned that about a year and a half ago, when I started thinking about this book, I emailed you. That was when I started thinking about this book again. So the first time I started thinking about this book, not this title and not this concept, but about kind of these ideas, was back in 2013 when Aishigal and I lived in Cambodia. We lived in Cambodia for 6 months. And when we were there, I was there for my PhD research. And when we were there, we lived in an apartment, and there was a security guard that worked there as well, or that worked there. And I got to know him. And, Cambodia is just a fantastic, exciting, wonderful place to live. And there's a lot of poverty there, as you know, and I heard his story. Then I connected with other people as well. And I actually formally interviewed our security guard. His name is Sak, and a great grandmother who was 81 years old at the time. She bought and sold stuff to survive. She was an entrepreneur. And she also helped build the only church in her village. And then I also interviewed a garment factory worker. I only met her once, but she worked, 7 days a week, hours and hours, I think 70 hours a week, usually, making clothes. Actually, she wasn't a sewer. She wasn't a seamstress. She was a quality control checker. And, but each of these stories are included in the book as small little chapters throughout. So of course, this book, first of all, if somebody is looking for a hardcore theology book, this is not the book to buy. This is a book that is fun. It was fun to write and it's fun to read, I think. I'm biased, of course.
But no, it is. I read it. I was telling you when I helped edit it, I was at a camp meeting speaking during the week, and my family didn't travel with me, and I was reading in between speaking events, and it was fun and easy to read. And I told you when I sent it to you too, like it was thought provoking. I was leaving my hotel to go to the church, and there was a homeless man I could see outside of Panera on the corner the entire time that I'm reading this book, by the way, with a sign. And so when I left to head to the church, like your stories and all the things that you are encouraging us to think about, like I'm literally looking at I'm watching this guy the entire time, thinking about him and give to him, and then I'm leaving and I'm watching him in my rear view mirror, like hardcore, like thinking about what's his story, like, where are his parents, he's older, but what do his parents think, like just everything, like how's his life gone. I had to slam on the brakes because there was a red light after I turned in front of me, and I was about to get on the highway, and I wasn't paying attention to the car in front of me. I mean, I was inches away from hitting them.
I'm glad that you didn't.
Yeah. I was thinking about the man on the corner, and I was watching him in my rearview mirror. So, but yeah, go ahead. So, but it's that kind of book. Like it makes you, think about the person.
Yeah. And so the book isn't just, my stories, but it's also the stories of these 3 special people in Cambodia. And we get to hear their stories and, what their lives are like. And so, yeah, so that's one of the unique things I think about this book is that it weaves their stories into it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, why do you see a need for this book, or maybe how can this book help you say it's not a hardcore theology book, and it's not, but I do think it's a helpful book and could be a helpful book for maybe like a small group, or a simple church study, or even just reading group. Why do you see a need for a book like this, and how can it help others? What kind of resources come along with it potentially?
Sure. Well, there is inside of the book, there is a free companion study guide that is co-authored with my dad. And it has reflective questions and prayers and Bible passages, challenges, areas to journal. And that's a free download for all readers. And so that is something that can be used by small groups. Also, if there are churches that, want to incorporate this book into the life of their church, I'm more than happy to have, a chat with them or with your church. Of course, the companion study guide can sort of act as a study guide, along, with personal study or with group study. But yeah, your question about the need. So the need for a book like this, I think, relates to just what life is like these days. Even before, well, life has always been, in my opinion, really self-focused. And that's very normal. It's natural. In the book, I share that, it's not natural for us to have a deep concern for strangers. But yet God loves, strangers just like he loves us. And, as Americans, most of us, only live in America, or we only are exposed to a very small amount of things that go on inside of the whole world. And I think it's healthy for us to be exposed to other ideas, to the realities of the world. That's why I talk in the third chapter about empathy, about how we can, incorporate that into our lives by learning about the needs of others. And in chapter 1, I talk about, this in between, living as a person with gratitude. And, I'm thankful for all that I have, for all the opportunities and privileges that I have. But at the same time, I'm humble, or I need to be humble, that number one, those things can go away at any point. And number two, a lot of people in the world, for example, the people on the street, don't have all the things that I have, or even a fraction of it. So I think that as Christians, I think that we could go a long way with developing in our hearts a deep desire to care and a deep discomfort. I think that we should be full of discomfort because of the realities of the world that are not just like the way I have it, or just like the way that people have it who are watching probably.
Mhm.
The world is full of problems that we can't even imagine. It's big and small. And I think that we can all go at least some way to improve the way that we think and understand the world.
Yeah. Yeah. So knowing you, when you talk about that discomfort, um, I don't think you're talking about like a lack of peace. Um, but I assume you're talking about a lack of comfort, that the way things are just the way things are, and there's nothing we can do about it. Um, is that what you mean by that?
Yeah.
Talk about
So,
that a little bit, because right,
yeah.
especially for us, like in general, not just Americans, but anybody who is fairly well off, like you start talking about discomfort, and it's like, oh no, I'm not doing anything that's uncomfortable. I mean, I mean, I'm bad at it. I do think Americans are really bad at putting themselves in uncomfortable situations anymore, or being okay with discomfort. So, what do you mean by that? Um, yeah.
One of the things I mentioned in the book is being overwhelmed. I think it's a good thing to sometimes be overwhelmed in thinking about all that I have, even if it's not all that I want, right? Most of us don't have everything that we want and then some, but yet we still need to realize that we have a lot more than most others. Okay.
Wait, you don't have everything you want?
Not yet. And so whenever I say discomfort, I don't mean spiritual discomfort. I don't think. Maybe I should dig into that a little bit more about what I actually mean or think about that. Thank you for asking me about that. Because I think that we should have shalom. I think that that's God's desire, right? Christ came on earth to bring God's kingdom on earth today, we believe, and in the future. And so it's working toward that. And to work toward that, sometimes we need to be in some discomfort to help us in that journey. And so when I say discomfort, I think it's just the reality, this gap, this realization that there's a gap. And maybe there's some guilt involved in that as well. That, okay, there's a gap. I've got a lot going on for me, even if it's not all that I want. But there's people around the world that don't have all this, or even a very tiny fraction of what I have. So I think that there should be some guilt. And I think that that relates to discomfort as well. There's a concept that I talk about in the book, what I call co-suffering. Co-suffering is the notion that whenever I personally or you personally suffer about something, small or big, that you also remember other people who are suffering. So it might be something like, for example, I stubbed my toe today on the wall. Tomorrow I have a throbbing toe for a day or two. So that's a very bad thing. And when we suffer, we think about ourselves, my toe, my toe, my toe. But what if we broadened that out? And what if we thought about all the people with chronic pain, the people with arthritis,
Yeah.
with all kinds of suffering. And that's what I call co-suffering. And in the book, I talk about the most profound experience that I had personally with co-suffering in a place I wasn't expecting it at all. And it's a really important concept. And I think it's something that we can remind ourselves to do, because it reminds us. And I think that this is a healthy reminder. That way we're not always caught up in ourselves, but we're reminded of other people in the world, people that we'll never know or even think about or see. And that, I think, is what I mean by discomfort.
Yeah, I like that idea too, of even intentionally entering in to suffering to remember those who live a life that are often suffering. Not that we're like, you know, hitting our, like, not that we're harming ourselves, which actually there's a tradition in Christianity where that was encouraged to uh, um, uh, to co-suffer even with Christ, which is not something that we necessarily need to do or should do, actually. While at the same time, I do think it's important to enter into to situations or or attitudes that help you think about those who suffer, or even when you do suffer, to think about other people, like you say, who suffer with chronic pain. I think one of the ways that is really easy, actually, for Christians to do this and encouraged biblically is fasting. I know anytime that I have spent a significant amount of time fasting, it's like, wow, like there are people who go hungry in the world. Uh, and, fasting one meal is one thing, fasting a day is one thing. But once you get a couple days in, you really start to like think like, okay, like this, some people go days with without eating, children and all those sorts of things. And you really actually start to have kind of an empathy, grow an empathy for the poor, or even the food poor. So I think that's one way to do that. Your book, Homeless at Harvard, is kind of that. I think that the co-suffering idea there. Not that I think people need to become homeless.
No,
Yeah,
not at all.
yeah. I don't think that's what we need to do, but to find ways like how do we enter into co-suffering without doing it in a way where like we're trying to punish ourselves, or um, yeah, I'm not sure what I'm trying to say there, but we avoid suffering at all costs.
Very normal.
It's very normal. Like, and
Yeah.
most of us, or at least I do, I live a very comfortable life, right, and try to avoid suffering at all costs.
Me too.
And so it is hard to think about those who suffer on a regular basis, even, or to have empathy. So,
Yeah. I don't think that we should intentionally put ourselves into a place where we suffer.
mhm.
That's not what I meant. What I did not mean is I'm going to kick the door really hard so that my toe hurts so that I can suffer with others. Of course, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that whenever I do that and whenever it does hurt, then I can feel that others are feeling. It's interesting that you mentioned fasting, Josh, because one of my footnotes in the gratitude and humility chapter relates to fasting, and that is actually, as you mentioned, something that we can bring on ourselves in a healthy way. And Mark Buchanan, I cite him in a Christian Century article, and what he says really struck me. And this was when I was at Anderson. I read his thing here, and it says, fasting is meant to scour our gut. It is God's intent that we feel the pains of hunger, the gnawing emptiness, the dizziness and weariness. That's how a third of the world lives. And if we never live that way, even briefly, how will we learn to care for the least of these? Fasting gives us a small taste of what their world is like, a taste we will never get if we do not for a time forsake the taste of food. And so that really relates to what you were saying, and also relates to co-suffering.
Yeah, it reminds me. We used to, in youth ministry, the World Vision used to have I think 36 hours of prayer and fasting. And one of the things we were doing is you were raising money for the hungry around the world. And you were hoping that the kids would think about these sorts of things. Some did, and then some just complained about not eating for the 36 hours. But
Very natural.
yeah, very natural, But raising awareness during that time of suffering was it was a good event for the kids, and something I recommend that adults do occasionally um, as well. So, what what's maybe one takeaway that you want people to get from this book? To kind of conclude here.
Yeah. Well, I think that helping from the heart and the culmination of developing these 7 attitudes of the helping heart, culmination of that is action. So I begin the book with the question, where do we begin? How do we begin? And I end the book with the same question, where do we begin? How do we begin? Well, we begin by developing these attitudes in our hearts, so that way we can be the people God wants us to be. But I think the culmination of that is the action. And it can be a small action now, it can be a big action, but I think it should be a thoughtful action. And I think that that's ultimately the people God wants us to be. God wants us to be acting people, not people who act on the stage, but people who act, right? People who are doing something, even if we don't know exactly what it is. There are resources out there that can help us. There are other books. There's this book. There's, sites that can help us understand how we can be of help to the world.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to start somewhere.
Yeah, there are, I think about our own church. Like I said, you actually conclude the book with a ministry from our own church. And as you just talk about action, I mean, there are ministries out there, right? If you want to engage with the poor and help with the poor, there are ministries to get involved with, and you can certainly use your gifts. If you're part of a local church, your church probably has some ministry that helps the poor connected with it, or they support a ministry, maybe even locally, that helps the poor, that you could join, support, engage with, or maybe start, right? You see a need and that's not being met, and you could start start a ministry. I do think the book motivates people to do that, and I would encourage people to uh, again to purchase the book and to think about what they can do to get involved, or to be a part of even a group of people that are caring for the least of these, as Jesus would call them often, or the forgotten. Um, John, how can you be reached? How can the book be purchased? You said,
Yeah.
one of the things you said, if a small group or a group of people maybe want to connect with you, Zoom with you, or I don't know, Google Meets out, whatever, I think they could
Absolutely.
potentially do that. And so how would people get a hold of you and purchase the book?
Sure. Well, the book is 7 Attitudes of the Helping Heart, How to Live Out Your Faith and Care for the Poor. And my website is just johnChristopherFrame.com, johnChristopherFrame.com. You can contact me on there. The book is widely available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and those other places as well.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, John, thank you for this time today. And thank you
It's
for
been
the
great.
book. Yeah. And for writing the book. Yeah, it's just so good to see you. And I hope people will take time to order your book and read it.
Thanks, Josh. I really appreciate it.